What we see here is a load curve of Germany during the different decades. On the x-axis, you see the time of day. You see here in the 60s the light green curve that we have a little demand during nighttime, and most of the demand occurs between sunrise and sunset. This changed a lot during the different decades, mainly because more base load power plants have been used, for example, lignite power or nuclear power, and these power plants are not very flexible, and in order to provide cheap electricity, they have to run at full power during the whole day, and therefore the consumption was artificially raised during the nighttime hours by some special tariffs, and in order to get a more equalized consumption pattern during the day. Nowadays, we should go in reverse, because we have a lot of solar power available during nighttime and no solar power at nighttime. Yes, we have wind power, but in general, such a load curve from the 60s would be more preferable nowadays. So this is a very cheap method to save storage costs, just to adapt, make dynamic tariff and adapt the load curve to the availability of wind and solar power.
The objective of this presentation is to provide a brief review of the common approaches of using demand response and energy efficiency to improve power system operations and reduce costs. We will also look at some of the emerging approaches like smart vehicle charging to further boost grid flexibility. As demand for electricity grows, utilities must ensure the adequate and reliable provision of power to meet demand. Different stakeholders have different concerns, though. National governments want secure, economic, reliable power with minimum global and local environmental impacts. Utilities typically want to avoid or defer investments in generation, transmission, and distribution, and they wish to maximize the utilization of existing resources. Customers want affordable energy that is sufficient for the services required in modern society. Energy efficiency and demand response are key tools to help utilities minimize costs, reduce pollution, improve reliability, and enable growing sources of variable renewable electricity, such as wind and solar. Energy efficiency is typically referred to as the first fuel because it is the cheapest option. And this is especially true in Asia, where demand has grown rapidly and energy security receives heightened attention. Let's look at an example. This chart shows air conditioning ownership for a variety of countries based on per capita income. The red dots show the percentage of households that own air conditioning, and the blue dots show the gross domestic product per capita using purchasing power parity. As countries grow, demand for air conditioning rises accordingly. The percentage of households that use air conditioning for cooling in emerging economies with hot and humid climates will increase rapidly in the coming decades. This is due to growing population, rising income, and declining air conditioning prices. Growth in Asia is expected to be especially strong. China, India, and Indonesia alone are expected to add over 1,500 terawatt hours of new load in the air conditioning sector over the next 30 years. Besides total demand, extensive ownership of air conditioners also affects daily and seasonal load profiles and eventually peak demand, with the majority of new demand growth concentrated during the hottest parts of the year. We expect the intraday load peak for most countries with high air conditioning penetration to move from the evening to the middle of the afternoon, when residential and commercial cooling demand coincides. This may better coincide with generation from solar plants, but demand-side measures can also help lower peak load and overall stress on the grid. Let's take a step back and talk more about what demand-side management actually is. The traditional definition is the planning, implementation, and monitoring of utility activities that are designed to influence customer use of electricity. DSM traditionally includes energy efficiency and conservation and demand response. But new additions to demand-side management include distributed energy resource management, such as smart electric vehicle charging, rooftop PV, and behind-the-meter storage devices. Related definitions and examples in this domain include the concept of energy efficiency, where you are using less energy to provide the same or even better services. And energy efficiency typically requires no change of behavior among consumers. An example of energy efficiency is replacing a 100-watt incandescent light bulb with a 12-watt light-emitting diode, or in an industrial setting, updating an induction motor with a variable speed drive motor. Energy conservation, on the other hand, is simply changing your behavior in the way that you use energy. As a father of 2 teenagers, I spend considerable amount of time asking people to turn off their lights when they leave a room. But another example of energy conservation might be to raise the thermostat settings in the summer to reduce your air conditioning usage. Demand response is focused on changing the way that consumers use energy so that it better matches the supply and demand conditions on the grid. Utilities can use incentives or prices and other direct control of equipment to better ensure that demand and supply are in balance on the grid. An example of demand response might be where a utility controls pre-cooling at a building and starts to cool it at noon rather than 3 o'clock when the temperature might be highest, but the grid conditions are also strained. Another example might be smart vehicle charging, where the charging of the vehicle automatically stops whenever there's peak load conditions. Finally, distributed energy resources. These are small-scale resources located on the distribution side of the grid, capable of generating, using, storing, or managing energy. These are widely diverse examples of distributed energy resources, but they include rooftop PV, behind-the-meter batteries, electric vehicles and chargers, smart inverters, which can provide special services for rooftop solar so that the panels are producing the right kind of power at the right time according to grid conditions. Other examples that are emerging include transactive energy that may be focused on blockchain technology, or home energy management systems, which are increasingly used throughout the world. Policymakers and utilities have long relied on demand-side management to lower energy demand and cut expensive peak load needs. These services are still important, but as more variable renewable energy generation, mainly wind and solar, is deployed, demand-side management will also need to support both the management of the distributed energy resources and the provision of flexibility needs. I think, as everyone here probably knows, as more and more variable renewable energy is added to the grid, the need for flexibility becomes more important. And demand-side management has the potential to provide greater and greater amounts of flexibility. Both utilities and policymakers are viewing customers increasingly as flexible grid resources because they can control when and where they use energy. Slide shows the relative impacts of energy efficiency and demand response in the United States. These trends would likely be similar in other countries. What we see on the left-hand side is the savings that energy efficiency provides, both in terms of megawatt hours and on peak demand measured in gigawatts. So we see that in the year 2017, for example, energy efficiency saved approximately 30 terawatt hours of electricity. Now, when you compare this to the national total of energy demand of 4,000 terawatt hours, it doesn't sound like much. 30 is much, much smaller than 4,000. But you must keep in mind that energy savings add up over time and are cumulative, so that over the long term, energy efficiency can have a significant impact on the amount of money needed to invest in new generation or new transmission. Looking at the right-hand side of this slide, we see the exact opposite impact from demand response. It is very effective at saving peak demand, but has very modest impacts on energy savings overall. Again, we see that in the year 2017, approximately 12 gigawatts of peak demand was saved through demand response. When you compare that to the national peak load of 700 gigawatts, it may not seem that impressive, but like energy efficiency, these impacts build up over time in a cumulative way. Now, here's a more regional view of the role that demand response currently plays in the United States. We can see that demand response saves anywhere between 1% to almost 4% of peak demand in different regions of the United States, with Texas having the most and New England having the least. It should also be noted that these are currently the levels of savings that are enabled, but much larger amounts could be achieved if additional policy measures are taken to make demand response more beneficial. Okay, here is a very traditional picture of the role that demand response can play in your power system and what different strategies are. For example, to reduce peak load, utilities will often use a term called peak clipping. And the idea here is to incentivize consumers to not use power during that peak load period. And they can do so either through setting of prices or by directly controlling equipment or setting up a market so that aggregators can convince consumers to stop using so much electricity during those peak times. That's when electricity is the most expensive, when you need to have expensive peak generating units on and when transmission is highly congested. That's the strategy there under peak clipping. Similarly, in valley filling, sometimes you can have very low periods of load where you cannot back down your generators enough to keep supply and demand in balance. Therefore, it can actually be cheaper to raise the demand during those periods so that you can keep generators online and you can avoid the startup costs or the ramping costs that are associated with keeping it at that very low level. Another example is strategic load growth. And we see this very prominently today in the United States, where utilities are promoting the use of electric vehicles because they see it as a new source of revenue growth, when more and more people will be charging their vehicles and consuming power when they would have otherwise consumed a petroleum product. Also, energy efficiency, the load conservation strategy is simply to lower the load profile uniformly throughout the day so that not only is peak load reduced, but overall demand for electricity is also reduced. Then there are these two other examples: flexible load shaping, which can refer to any strategic objective that the utility might want to require in terms of load shape, and then load shifting, which really is just a combination of the peak clipping and the valley clipping noted above. The benefits and challenges of demand-side management have been very, very well researched. And there's a rich literature dating back to the 1980s at least on why we should do more demand-side management and what impedes greater penetration of demand-side management. Some of the benefits, as I've noted earlier, are that DSM reduces peak load and energy use, which saves money on infrastructure and fuel, and that results in lower tariffs for consumers as well. DSM can also reduce pollution, energy insecurity, water use, health impacts, and more. DSM is typically referred to as the first fuel, as we noted earlier, because it can help match supply and demand at the lowest cost. Now, some select challenges associated with demand-side management. First, energy efficiency impacts can be difficult to measure without a counterfactual case. In other words, if you don't make the energy efficiency investment, you can't compare it to a case where you did make the energy efficiency investment and see what the differences are. So you can't see how effective it is being. And that can result in some significant barriers. And there are a variety of market failures that can impede energy efficiency. For example, the landlord-tenant problem, where if the tenant is paying for the utility bills each month, the landlord has no incentive to invest in more energy efficiency for that building because he or she will not see any of those benefits in monthly utility bills. And then finally, if electricity prices are highly subsidized, as they are in some regions of the world, there's little incentive to do energy efficiency or demand response. There are many, many other challenges and benefits that I haven't listed here, but that should at least remind you of some literature you've probably read on this already. Okay, now let's look at some of the steps involved in the DSM implementation process. We begin with an an end-use demand forecast of load. And this is focused on using bottom-up forecasting and not top-down approaches. Second, we undertake a load and market research to identify end-use patterns and potential market barriers. The third step is to define objectives in achieving the desired load shapes. And then fourth, which sectors and end users will be targeted and which measures will you use to target them? Next, we need to identify sources of finance for our process. For example, the legislature may have provided a wires charge that is added to each consumer's monthly utility bill, and that will provide a source of revenue to support some of these measures. Or in some countries, there are carbon taxes that also can be used to help finance DSM processes. Next, we review cost and viability options at a high level, and that feeds into designing the program, spelling out who will do what and when, and whatever penalties might be applied for non-compliance. Next, we perform more detailed cost-benefit analysis at the macro level to understand whether it makes sense for the jurisdiction to proceed. And then finally, we assess the socioeconomic and environmental impacts that would result from the DSM program. And at several steps in producing the final DS implementation plan, there's feedback loops where we might need to return to look at questions again. For example, after you perform the cost-benefit analysis, you might need to return to review the cost and viability options. Or once you have your DSM implementation plan, you may need to return to different steps in the process to see what the feedback effects are. Now let's look at some of the what I call building blocks of energy efficiency programs, and these can largely be applied to demand response programs as well. We have a number of different stakeholders involved in delivering demand-side management programs to consumers, and they range from academia to the private sector, government stakeholders, nonprofit or NGO donors, and utilities. And these stakeholders can do a number of different things to deliver demand-side management into the jurisdiction. They can pass legislation, for example, that sets targets for energy efficiency or demand-side management. They can build capacity among institutions or individuals, and this is often done through training programs. They can conduct outreach so that consumers are better informed about their energy choices. These often involve things like green labeling programs so that consumers know what the full life cycle costs of a purchase might entail rather than just the initial purchase cost. Delivery of demand-side management features, and utilities are often at the heart of doing that, but others can assist as well. Financing. How do you get money to support demand-side management programs on a consistent basis, especially if you have a difficult time with budgets each year in your country? And then finally, evaluation of energy programs like energy efficiency or demand response. This is an important step in ensuring that systems are not only designed properly from the start, but that feedback can be provided while the program is ongoing to make things work better. Continuing on with this focus on the building blocks of demand-side management, we see here an illustration of how the effectiveness of energy efficiency programs can improve based on the level of institutional capacity in a given country. And the higher level of institutional capacity you have, the greater effectiveness and magnification of impact you can achieve in your energy efficiency programs. Demand for demand-side management often exceeds available funding resources. So we must prioritize one project over another. How do we do this? Well, program administrators typically use cost-benefit tests to evaluate the feasibility of different energy efficiency or demand response investments. And then they can prioritize or rank projects that have the best returns. And in some cases, the cost-benefit methodology is actually quite complicated and controversial. So stakeholders must come together and agree on the best methodology to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. In some cases, special versions of cost-benefit tests might need to be developed, especially if you're trying to target special classes of consumers, such as low-income households or people with pre-existing health conditions. Now, traditionally, cost-benefit tests have focused on both energy savings and peak energy savings. And there's a whole bunch of complicated metrics involved in that. Today, however, we must also look at additional goals associated with demand-side management. And these include the distributed energy resource value that's provided, for example, as noted earlier, and the flexibility benefits that demand-side management investments can provide. All these together are now the new metrics against which a cost-benefit test must conform. So on a larger level, the discipline of evaluation, measurement, and verification, or EMV, it's important to understand whether or not the goals of a DSM project have been achieved or not, and how efficiently they may have been achieved. It's important to use EMV to make adjustments in demand-side management programs so that future actions can become more efficient and impactful. Okay, now let's go through 3 quick case studies on different types of demand-side management that have been used around the world. And the first example is from Mumbai in India, where a 6-story office building constructed in 1972 was seeing very poor performance in terms of the energy efficiency and the uncomfortableness in the building. And so the building owner financed a bunch of measures to improve the efficiency of the building, and they focused on the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system and the lighting system, and then did a few other different things like put a green roof on the building, and then later they installed double glazed windows. And the important part of this is that in India, for a lot of commercial buildings, they pay a lot for electricity compared to residential consumers. And so the owner of the building self-financed all of these energy efficiency measures that they installed over time. Looking at the second slide of this first case study, we can see some of the benefits that were achieved in the investment in HVAC systems and lighting in India. Again, the baseline year against which the impacts were measured are 2009 to 2010. And what we see in the post-retrofit world is that electricity savings amounted to 12%, while the reduction in electricity cost resulted in a savings of 29%, which is quite significant. In the best scenario, we saw an estimated payback period of 4.7 years, which is quite modest. In other scenarios, that payback period was longer. And other important savings are noted from the green roof that was installed. Temperatures on the top floor of the building declined by 10 degrees Celsius or more. This resulted in not only energy savings, as noted above, but much greater comfort for the inhabitants of the building. This was a clear comfort and health impact. It should also be noted that this building, or this energy efficiency retrofit, was awarded LEED Gold status in the year 2011. But the efficiency upgrades were not without their own challenges. For example, this was an aging building, but it had ongoing operations, and the company could not afford to shut down operations and move to another location while the upgrades were being performed. So what they did was focus all of that work on the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system at nights and on weekends. And additionally, they did not have any architectural blueprints for the building, so they were kind of working in the dark. And they had to invest a significant amount of money to commission new drawings that would help inform where the ductwork was and where all the electricity lines were. But the benefit of that is that these new drawings could be used in the future when additional upgrades were considered. Finally, for the lighting efficiency upgrades that were envisioned, domestic manufacturers offered only limited options in their equipment. So the company procured lighting through special vendors and stimulated the market for greater supply of high efficiency lighting products in Mumbai. Our second case study looks at residential water heating in New Zealand. And as you can see from the map, in winter, electric water heating can account for a large amount of energy. The utility there is called Vector, and it's the largest electric distributor in New Zealand. Residential electric hot water demand can account for 20% of peak load in winter. So if you're able to provide a cost-effective way to control residential hot water heating, it can be very valuable to the grid. And in this case, Vector was considering, or actually requiring, that a substation would need to be upgraded by the year 2023 if they didn't take action to reduce the peak load there. And the solution that they came up with was to replace the old-fashioned, what's called ripple frequency control to turn on and off hot water heaters with a wireless platform. And in the old ripple frequency control, the utility is able to send out a very low frequency pulse into the grid, and all the water heaters that receive that pulse on the grid will respond by either turning the system on or off. but it's very clumsy in a way. It doesn't, it can't target specific users or focus on regions where grid overload is the highest. So instead, Vector came up with a wireless way to control hot water heaters at a very low cost, and they could have a much more granularity in which hot water heaters they turned on or turned off. And as you can see from this chart, the impact on the number of kilowatts used was significant. This was only a pilot project. It was only done on roughly 100 homes or so at the time, but they demonstrated that this wireless control approach was much more effective than the ripple control. The utility was able to see a peak load reduction of about 40% on certain evenings in the wintertime. And most importantly, there were no customer complaints in the way that the utility managed the turning on and turning off of the hot water heaters. Okay, now let's move to our third case study, which takes place in Colorado with the utility Xcel Energy. Xcel Energy provides power and gas to many consumers in the state of Colorado, and they've been conducting demand-side management programs as part of their integrated resource planning for over 20 years. And the benefits that Xcel sees in doing demand-side management in Colorado is both energy savings and demand savings, which offset the need to invest in additional generation and transmission. And the demand-side management helps integrate the increasing amount of renewables on the system. At some instances in Colorado, wind generation can account for over 60 or even 70% of total demand. So it's important to have a lot of demand-side flexibility in the system. And finally, demand-side management offers the opportunity to reduce the stresses in the distribution system. And some of the activities that are included in the Xcel programs in commercial and industry, they focus on efficiency in lighting, cooling, motors, and data centers. And in households, focus is on energy use feedback, efficient lighting, school education kits, residential heating, and refrigeration and freezers. And then finally, Colorado believes it's especially important to focus on low-income programs, education and market transformation, and demand response programs. So I believe the legislature requires Xcel to include these elements in its demand-side management program. So this chart attempts to show some of the impacts from the Colorado DSM program. In 2019, it's estimated that 504 gigawatt hours of energy demand was achieved and a peak reduction of 133 megawatts. And then you can see the information on what it cost to deliver these services in that second bullet. If you compare the cost, it's less than 1.5 US cents per kilowatt hour over the lifetime, which is lower than the cost of any other source of new generation, whether it's utility scale solar at $1,600 per kilowatt in capacity capital costs, or for natural gas about $1,000 per kilowatt in capital costs. And at the center of Colorado's demand-side management program is efficient lighting, which provides over 54% of the total savings. And then to better address some of the distribution level challenges, Colorado's using special micro-targeting to reduce the investment needs for distribution transformers and feeder upgrades. So that's a novel way to look very carefully at location-specific variables. Okay, now we can look at some of the emerging issues in demand-side management, and here we'll focus on electric vehicle charging. And we have 4 examples here of how electric vehicle charging could change and either help support managing the grid or create increasing challenges. In the first example, where we have simple additive assumptions, in the top left figure, we can see that vehicle charging results in basically uniform additional load throughout the day. In other words, the load shape does not change, just the total amount of demand increases. Now, that varies in the second figure on the top right side, where you have both workplace charging of electric vehicles, and which occurs during the daytime, obviously, and then home charging of electric vehicles more focused on the evening. And you can see that that has a significant impact on the load shape over the course of the day. Now, some of these begin to get a little increasingly complicated. In the bottom left-hand side, we've added photovoltaic generation to that, and then the concept of net load, which is the normal load minus the PV generation in this case. And again, we have workplace charging, and we have home charging, and then things can be increasingly complicated in a scenario such as that. And then finally, in an optimized way, we could see how flexible load and PV generation could result in a more optimized EV load, which is much more of a straight line. Not always, but typically, the more you can flatten out the demand or the load profile, the cheaper it will be to operate your system. So it'll be very interesting to see how these things play out in the future, and whether, for example, simple smart charging like what they call V1G, whether that continues to be more dominant, or whether vehicle to grid services, where the vehicle can actually send power back to the grid, if that emerges as a viable technology, we may see a much different outcome than if it doesn't succeed. So, to summarize everything that we've just talked about, we've learned that managing demand helps to reliably meet increased load, and it defers investment in generation, transmission, and distribution system upgrades. Demand-side management supports grid flexibility and the integration of variable renewable electricity, and it helps achieve broader policy objectives. Demand-side management is more than just load management. It includes energy efficiency, demand response, energy conservation, and distributed energy resource management. Demand-side management can also be used to support medium to long-term planning, model and forecast with an understanding of potential demand, enhance demand modeling and forecasting approaches with bottom-up modeling approaches and resolution of end uses. So with that, I will end this, and I thank you very much for your attention.
So after this introduction into demand-side management, we want to take a look into other flexibility options. Here we see a nice overview of the different options and the penetration of VRE, that means variable renewable energies. So here we see on the y-axis the costs. So lower part is low costs, upper part is high costs, and on the x-axis the share of variable renewable energies, just like wind and solar. So what we discussed already was the demand response side. So here in the middle with the dark blue one, residential and industrial measures. This is a relatively expensive measure. If we go down and see the reddish part here, so we see that we could also use more efficient hydro and thermal co-optimization. We could use also shorter dispatch intervals or use intraday markets. We can revise auxiliary services requirements at markets. We can improve the forecasts for wind and solar. This also leads to less dispatching and better use. So faster, updated regularly and closer to the generation. The yellow part is a retrofitting of existing thermal units as a backup. So we want to decrease the minimum load, we want to decrease startup times, and we want to increase the ramp rates, so how fast we can switch on and off power plant. We also can take a look, which is a bit more expensive, but also can serve for a higher share of variable renewable energies for new flexible power plants, such as gas power plants or X2 power. So X2 power, that means we can use either gas or hydrogen to generate power. And we go to the other blue part, as we discussed already on the left side, demand response, residential and industrial options. So we can also think about, in the light blue part, of about transmission expansion, the distribution, the strengthening, so-called FACTS, that means flexible AC transmission. So this is also gives some additional flexibility. We can use energy storage that we discussed already, for example, pumped hydro or advanced pumped hydro batteries, or also thermal storage or electro-fuel storage, which is also discussed. The problem here is the conversion efficiency and the reconversion efficiency. If we go a step further, almost to 100% of renewable energy share, we can carry out a sector coupling. So we couple the sectors of electricity, mobility, and heat production. So for example, we can carry out hydrogen production. We can use heat pumps. So heat pumps require electricity, but the amount of energy is much less in order to perform a heating task. Also, you can create cold. Actually, each refrigerator is a heat pump transporting heat away from the inner of the refrigerator and thus creating coldness. Also, we can think about electrical vehicles as an electricity options. The batteries are often not fully used. Usually, the actual travel distances within a day are quite short, so you can provide some of the capacity of your battery for flexibility purposes. And another impact of variable renewable energies is the increased net load ramps. So therefore, we have to provide a fast load following. This takes place also in between some minutes and some hours. Also, another consequence of the wind and solar use is the increased cycling, increased challenging to dispatch inflexible units. So this is a unit commitment on the system operations levels, which takes place in between hours and days. There's also a more costly option on the operation flexibility side. So we can carry out pooling of resources, which helps a lot. We can take a look at intraday markets. We can improve the forecasting for wind and solar. We can also co-optimize hydrothermal units. On the left side, we already discussed about demand side flexibility or demand response. If we take a look at the longer time frame, we can carry out sector coupling, as I mentioned already, via electrical vehicles or via power to heat option or via power to gas, could be methane or hydrogen, that gas. We can also think about supply side flexibility. So we can take a look at the synthetic internia. This is synthetic internia. So what are internia? So formerly we got very large scale power plants such as lignite or nuclear power plant, which had a very heavy generating unit, a synchronous generator, which served as a flying wheel, and this is called internia. So this is kind of energy storage which makes the system more smooth. This is not usually the case at variable renewable energies, maybe at hydropower, but for wind and solar, usually you are operating with variable speeds, and therefore the generation units of variable renewable energies, such as wind power, they do not turn synchronously to the grid frequency. So what you do usually, you rectify it, make a DC current out of it, and then electronically convert it into AC current. So there is no flywheel anymore, so there is no internia anymore, and therefore you cannot count on this internia. Therefore, you have to provide some synthetic internia. Synthetic internia are electronic units which provide the same parameters as this real internia provided by the different turning masses of the synchronous generator. Also, you can throttle the variable renewable energy. That's also an option, but it's quite costly because you lose the throttle energy. So the most expensive option is the energy storage. So we can start for a very short amount of time via flywheels. Then we can go to batteries. For very large time frames up to seasonal balancing, we can use pumped hydro. So let's take a look how we implement those measures for demand side management and flexibility. The first step is to assess the current flexibility. So we take a look at the production cost modeling. We assess current levels of curtailment and loss of load. We assess overgeneration incidents and fluctuation of prices. We assess the cycling of units, means startup, ramping, and minimum generation incidents. We assess if operation reserves are adequate. We can perform some network studies. So we can assess if the system can efficiently regulate frequency and the voltages. We can assess if the system can recover from unexpected events. We can assess if the system has sufficient internia, either natural or synthetic ones. We can assess if transmission elements get overloaded. So if we identify some gaps, we can think about this. If we don't identify any gaps, we go directly a step further. But first, let's take it for granted that we found some gaps. So that means we go to step 2. We bridge the gaps following a least cost approach. First, we unlock existing flexibility, means we take a look at the market and regularity options. We dispatch units based on merit order. We train staff at generating units to operate plants flexibly. So often the personnel there is not very much used to carry out a lot of load changes. So this changes now with increasing variable renewable energies. So you also have to change a bit the mentality that is predominant there. So you can also do pooling with neighbors to level out some generation and flexibility gaps. You can adjust operating reserves based on new needs. In the second step, you can implement new demand-side management schemes. You can invest in new assets. So you can have a transmission enhancement. We already saw with the effects with the flexible AC transmission system. We can retrofit existing units we can invest on new generation and or storage. As a step 3, we will access the future of flexibility. We can optimize variable renewable energies. It has to be not sitting, but siting. They're optimizing the siting of wind and solar using geospatial optimization. We saw this on the case of Italy, where we saw this for the case of Italy. Remember when we after the chapter with wind and solar, we first discussed the different correlations and anti-correlation issues for the case of Great Britain. And then we discussed about the geospatial differences for the correlation and anti-correlation of wind and solar. This is exactly what we're dealing with here. So we can estimate variable renewable energy production based on location and policy goals. We can also estimate the future net load. For example, we have to think about more electrical vehicles coming in and how they influence the flexibility and the grid in general. Second, the least cost capacity expansion to identify future assets. So we study the net load to assess needs for cycling. We optimize non-variable renewable energy capacity mix based on future technologies. We identify additional flexibility, for example, by storage or demand-side management. We assess benefits of sector coupling. And the third step, we repeat. Step 1, assess operationability of long-term plan identified on previous steps. And after step 1, if we identify some flexibility gaps, we want to go to step 2 again, and then to step 3. That was it. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the course. If you have further questions, just leave it in the comments or send me an email. Thank you very much.